This $5 invested today in 100 years from now could be the equivalent of $1 million. You can store 24 words on a piece of metal right now, and your great-grandchildren might see you as the most visionary man for having stored $5 away for them. Bitcoin isn't just a transactional tool that's cool because you can send it by a bot on Reddit. It's the finality of human realization, and it is basically heaven on earth, the blockchain. It is what matters. There are massive existential danger if you start modifying yourself. We have to stop. We have to basically stop science now. Realize that the entire fiat system is not your money. Even if you have the bills in your hands, it's not your money.
You wrote a book about gene editing, if I can say it like that, so in a really simple terms. And you also, I think we got in contact because we wrote about Bitcoin on Twitter. And so it's interesting you bring up the dangers of editing genes. And for me, it's always like it's really dangerous to edit the money supply with the fiat money. Do you see there is an connection between like stepping into nature and editing something artificially?
I think there is, and it's the story of parasitic signals. If we have a channel of communication, you and I'm sending you stuff, you're receiving it, there's a legitimate reason why this channel of communication exists. And there's a reason why the human brain has evolved to process language. But there are certain signals in which a third party shows itself in the middle. And that happens to money, and it happens to in gene editing. It happens into whatever situation a third party benefits from messing up the social signals or whatever signals, informational signals between two partners. And these third parties, they are really, in the case of money, they are the money printers. They inject a false signal into the money supply. Money would be perfectly working if there wasn't anyone to print it. And if all of these tokens that we have, whether it's cash or either in bills or in currency, if they were loose out there and no one was able to print them, it would all work because there would be no place for a false signal. But the false signal comes when you have the ability to print, which systematically has happened to all monies in the world in the history of civilization.
I mean, you also talked about before about gene editing itself. Maybe for people that don't know anything about it, as myself, what is gene editing and why is it dangerous?
So my book is The Revolutionary Phenotype, the amazing story of how life begins and how it ends. I was in academia and I was looking at the state of evolution and our science of evolution. And I was pretty satisfied. I'm a biologist and I was looking at the work of Dawkins. I was pretty satisfied that Richard Dawkins, The Selfish Gene, explains how life forms evolve. So it's natural selection. You have certain members of a species are different. They are slightly different, and that difference makes them better at making babies. So they make more babies. These babies inherit genetically the differences of their parents. And that's how you move in evolution from a bacteria to an elephant. The bacteria got better a little bit in various ways, eventually become a multicellular organism. Eventually, some multicellular organism outcompete the others, and you get lions, you get elephants, you get mooses. So I was satisfied that the theory of evolution, as laid out that way, explains the vast majority of what we observe, if not all. But then I started asking myself about gene editing and what happens when life forms start artificially playing with their genes. And I found things when I asked this question that were challenging, that if it happened in nature, that would challenge the view of the selfish gene of Richard Dawkins. Because once you have a life form that attains a technological level that can afford to play with its own genes, suddenly Darwin isn't quite what's happening. Suddenly you have a process of self-domestication. And it's the process that humanity has engaged in for the last few hundred years. as it was slowly headed toward genetic manipulation of itself. And at this point, we don't know for sure whether we're doing it, because there is a professor in China that has claimed to have done the first modification of human babies through genetic editing using CRISPR as a tool. CRISPR is a molecular tool that comes onto your DNA, removes the letter, adds another one instead. But whether we have done it or not, we are very close to doing it. So whether that professor was honest and real, or whether he was a fake, doesn't really matter. The fact is, we have been constantly headed toward understanding our genome better and wanting to modify it better. Because the more you understand the human genome, the more you have ideas about what you could fix. If you don't know anything about DNA, it might not be interesting for you to know that you could modify it. But if you start knowing, well, this gene will cause Alzheimer's later, this gene will give you Parkinson's disease in 60 years. Now you start being tempted at modifying the human genome. And we have a history of doing it on other plants for agriculture, for improving our productivity. We have a history of farming animals, selecting their features, making cows more fat, pigs more fat, so that they give more energy when they're farmed, making plants more resistant to certain pesticides so we can spray them generously. We've been doing these genetic modifications of everything around us. But what my theory showed is that if you genetically modify yourself, you enter a completely different evolutionary regime. And this is important to understand. We could have kept modifying the pigs, modifying the chicken, modifying the corn, and it's not that dangerous. Now there are vegans, there are these organics people who are anti-GMO. These people will tell you that it's dangerous, and it's true. There are small dangers to genetic modifications of other organisms. But what the theory of phenotypic revolution reveals is that there are massive existential danger if you start modifying yourself. And in fact, I claim that phenotypic revolutions have happened before on Earth. They have happened 4 billion years ago when the first DNA being came into existence. It was through a phenotypic revolution. So there has been a life form of this planet that has committed the exact same error that we're currently committing, that has been tempted by the genetic modification of itself. And they died, and they left alive only the RNA viruses of today, and they gave birth to us. I say, let us not do what they did. Let us not be tempted by self-modification to the point where we edit ourselves away from existence. Because this is what awaits a species that gets engaged into gene modification. They enter an evolutionary regime that resembles the one that you see in ants and bees. A regime where there is a queen and there are sterile workers. Now, how do we get from gene modification to a sterile worker system? It's quite simple. It's centralization. If you what the ants and bees have done is they have centralized the act of reproduction. There used to be their ancestors used to be free insects. They were flying around, finding a mate, reproducing, and that's it. And their babies would in turn reproduce. That's how evolution works generally. What the bees and ants have done is they have centralized the genetic carrier, what we call today a queen. They started entrusting a central entity to be that queen, carry the genes to the next generation. And as a result, the sterile workers' genes started not to matter at all. In fact, they started not to matter as to how they make the sterile worker ant fit to live. They started to matter as to how they make the queen fit to reproduce. And therefore, the sterile worker ants have evolved in service to the queen. When you centralize your genes, you become a servant to the genetic interest of the central entity that edits your gene. I would say there is a parallel to make with what we talked about with money. When the economy is so influenced by a Fed that prints money, everyone starts not being doing the things that they should do to make society productive, but instead they evolve into a direction to please the Fed, to control who is on the Fed, to know in advance what the Fed will do, to bet on the market according to how the Fed will inflate the stock market. So suddenly you have an economy that instead of caring at the bottom who we serve, who do we sell to, how do we make money, they start caring to the top. They start caring, how do we serve the Fed? How do we align better with the Fed's interest? And that's the evolutionary situation in which a sterile ant finds itself. The sterile ant cannot have babies. And so its only ways to ensure that there are copies of itself in the next generation is to save her queen. And now we enter in a phenotypic. That's basically also what happens in a phenotypic revolution. So if humanity were to start editing their genes, we would start having some central entity, an AI, a computer that says, hey, I have a list of 10,000 genes. Here's how they should be if you want to be a happy human. And you might say, well, aren't there different ways to be a happy human? Oh, yes. Here's 100,000 ways in which you could be a very productive, happy human. Which one do you want? Do you want 500 of these genes? Do you want this? Do you want to mix this with this? Do you want to be a super athlete or do you want to be a super high IQ scientist? There are trade offs, and the AI will always be the best tool for us to negotiate through these trade offs and say, okay, I don't want Parkinson's disease. But if not having Parkinson's disease means I won't be an athlete, then okay, I'm fine with a little bit of chance of having Parkinson's disease, but be sure to be an athlete. So you're going to start having these central decisions being made, not so much by humans, but by AIs, by computers, because they will be impossible to handle for the human brain. Think about computing what is the ensemble of consequences from 10,000 different genes in three different variants each, or maybe 100 different variants each, all on every situation of your life. It's impossible to process, and eventually we will be delegating the process of choosing the best genes. What are the best genes? To a central entity. Now, the day we do this, I say, we become a queen sterile worker colony. The day we do this, it doesn't really matter how good you are of an individual for yourself. It really matters how good of an individual you are for the central queen. And it's simply because when you start trusting a recipe for your genes, whether that recipe is written on some paper or whether it's written on a blockchain or in an AI's CPU, that thing becomes the thing that evolves. In the same way that the day the sterile worker ants started trusting the queen started to evolve, and the sterile worker ants started to evolve with respect to the queen. We will be evolving with respect to an AI if we start printing our genes. And so my book and my theory, I hope, will make humans realize before we commit to that very dark path of becoming a slave entity to another central entity, we have to stop. We have to basically stop science now. I know that we could explore science while also not exploring genetic modification, but we should stop most of it. And we should stop most of it knowing that the more we know about our own genes, the more our descendants will be tempted to edit ourselves out of existence. That is the message of my book, and that is what I hope to bring to humanity. We must realize that of the millions of things we could have discovered, this thing is the one we should not. We should not want to discover it, and we should close the box, close the Pandora box of genetic editing.
It's fascinating for me that there can be technical advancement that are really good for everyday problems. For like, even if you take now the example of Bitcoin, it's a technical advancement on fiat money.
Yeah.
Gold was there before, then was the fiat technology advancement. It was like maybe a step back, and now we're hopefully going a step forward. But then there's also technical advancements that are really dangerous. AI in itself can be really dangerous, as you said. When AI comes then in contact with gene editing, it becomes even more dangerous for that. So it's interesting to see how technical advancements can be good and bad. And you also talked about that Bitcoin itself was helping you survive censorship. How did what was the story around that?
Oh, well, Bitcoin has been centered to my life since 2015 because I've been giving up the academia in 2015. And I had already been in contact with Bitcoin because I was a public science educator then. And I was in the academia doing a postdoc at Duke University, doing monkey research. I was researching monkey brains. And and I wanted to give up the mainstream system because even before realizing that Bitcoin would be the key to my exodus, I realized that there was something sick in the system. I got targeted by lots of hate, lots of campaigns of hate, lots of intelligence agencies, because I decided when I went out of the university that I would be a free public speaker, that I would be an intellectual engaging publicly, and that I would touch upon, controversial subjects like race, and I would just say what I think about it, which people can't do when they're at the employment of the academia. So first, I was looking for liberty before I found Bitcoin, but even then, I was somewhat in contact with Bitcoin because when I did a Q&A in 2013 or 14, people on Reddit started sending me bot tips of Bitcoin. And back then they would send you like zero point 0.1 Bitcoin or 0.05 Bitcoin. And that would be worth then $5, $10. And I was like, oh, that's cool. A machine of the internet for sending money. That's very cool. But I didn't think of it then as the center of my life in terms of acquiring wealth. I didn't think I have to pour down all of my money in it, but it was a cool functionality that was emerging then. And that's how I saw it. Eventually, all of my tips and people giving me gifts and donations, I sold this Bitcoin for something like $120 in 2014, 2015. Bad decision, but that's okay. Getting into the real Bitcoin cycle and understanding it takes a couple of bull runs, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But then I was I was also astonished by the fact that very early in my life, before it became a meme to say it, I realized that the entire fiat system is not your money. Even if you have the bills in your hands, it's not your money because there's a judge there who can attack you the way they attack Trump, who can decide that your buildings are not your buildings. There's your exes that can go at you. And I was starting to get a series of exes that they go at you because they want custody of the children and they start making false allegations against you. Then I started realizing, and so the judge gives them custody, even if the allegations are false. And then I'm going to get drain my fiat money to them forever because I'm going to have to pay child custody and alimony and that kind of stuff. I didn't want any of this. So, very early in my life, before I found that Bitcoin was the answer to all this, I was like, there is a sickness in the world. You can't live in areas that are too leftist. You get these exes that are going after you. They lie in court. The judge believes them. Judges in civil court are unreliable. They can go after your property. They can drain your bank account. Basically, I realize it's not worth it to even work in the traditional system because then I have to go beg for a position at 30, 40K a year where I barely survive, where I'm getting drained by the apartment rent and all of this to just look like I work. And really, that money, I'm going to pay half of it in tax, and then the rest will get drained by judges and exes. So I was like, no, I might. I decided basically it's better to be homeless than to work for this system of crap. And the day I decided that, I actually never became homeless, amazingly. But I had decided in my mind, if homeless is the result of liberty, then homeless it is. I've decided that I could live in the forest. Now, that was a mind change that totally changed my life, and that actually kind of paradoxically led me to acquire much more wealth that way. Because now I was centered about what matters, which is I want to be close to my family. I'm not going to accept jobs where I have to slave away most of my time of the day just to get to my job. I'm not gonna spend my mornings in traffic to get to a place because that's the place where they've decided to give me a job. I'm doing none of this anymore. I'm going to be a free thinker. And at that time I wasn't making money from my free thinking work. So I the book wasn't out, my YouTube channel wasn't out yet, and it wasn't monetized. At least it was already active but not monetized. And I said, if that gives me $0, I'll still do this and I'll survive on eating grass if I need to. But I'm not working for this system anymore. And from here on out, I'm only accepting work from home where I'm able to stay with my loved ones, where I can concentrate on what matters. And from there, I started actually making more money that way, because then you're not slave to the insurance system where you have to pay the insurance of your car, so you have to go to work, you have to pay all sorts of things just to be able to go to a brick and mortar facility to work. And from that perspective, I started making more money, and that money was mine. And eventually, it's in 2000, from 2016 and 2018, I realized that first I started making a massive amount of money from the coming out of my book, but that was in 2018. But I started making a lot of money also from YouTube, because back then YouTube was free thinking in its purest form. So it was the perfect place for a polemicist like me to show up and say some provocative stuff and things that basically civilization should have heard for decades, but that it wasn't prepared to hear truths about controversial subjects, about race, about the state of America right now, about the corruption of the current system. So I made a lot of money, and then I started thinking, okay, how do I protect myself against everything? Because it's very easy to fall back into the system. It's very easy to say, I'm going to use that money to buy a house, live my little regular life, go to work to pay what's left of the mortgage. But I didn't want any of this. I was like, if it worked, if I got rewarded for calling out a system very early, I need to flee this system with everything that worked as a trick. And what worked to me is exodus. And I believe that what describes the current state of humanity with respect to Bitcoin, it's an exodus. You have an exodus of all interest, of all efforts to make money. Civilization, the physical state of it has become so low, and it's become so impossible to make money because, oh, you're going to develop a little innovative business of some kind that offers something interesting. You're going to be stuck with the sludge of the state coming in, asking that you overpay your employees, saying you can't hire them on Monday the 20th because it's a holiday. It's such a mess, and you're gonna have to pay worker security, and you're gonna have to pay for their retirement eventually. You're not going to make money selling burgers at $7 in this economy. So I believe that what describes Bitcoin perfectly with its relationship to current humanity is there is an exodus of intelligence, an exodus of desire for productivity, and we call out a system that has made it impossible for us to do our work. I can't go into academia and beg the state for money to make monkey research and make the state of science advance with this, because I have to spend my days around red tape and asking for permissions and ethics committees. I'm much better at home, using 24/7 of my time concentrating on theoretical ideas. I'm much more efficient that way than I would be under the state system, which I've been very successful on up to 28 years old. I was always gathering the best awards from the state for best scientific projects. I was always within the top 100 of my nation in terms of soliciting funding and awards. But I can't keep doing this. First, it's money that you've stolen to other people that you're paying me with. They didn't want to pay these taxes for JF to be a scientist. And second, they're not even getting back from that money, in the sense that I'm taking that money from the state to be a scientist. I'm inflating my ego, inflating my capacity by accomplishing these technical realization in my super specialized field. The reality is people are not getting back their money's worth. It's a whole expanding bureaucracy, the bureaucracy of science. And it's just because people are sympathetic towards science, because yes, there's a handful of scientific discovery that have massively, like, by orders of magnitude, improved the world. But the reality is 99% of the scientists aren't these massive discoverers. They are doing the little technical stuff that will never serve you. So I was like, okay, I need to get out of this system. And between 2016 and 2018, I realized, starting to listen to the Bitcoin propaganda, although I was super sympathetic to Bitcoin already, I start convincing myself, and I start realizing Bitcoin isn't just a transactional tool that's cool because you can send it by a bot on Reddit. It's the finality of human realization, and it is basically heaven on earth. The blockchain, it is what matters. And so that's where I started saying all of my money, which I got very lucky to be at a time where YouTube would let you speak free. That is a time of civilization that lasted about 2 or 3 years, that we could do free live streams with free thought. I'm starting to be censored there. So it's the same thing that I faced in normie world, these judges, these exes, false allegations, mainstream media coming after me and repeating those false allegations that were false when my exes did it. And I'm like, okay, I got money luckily from this system for basically a year of fame on YouTube. I'm gonna take all that money, I'm putting it in Bitcoin, and this will give me freedom, and freedom for my descendants. And since then, it's been up, up, up. So, in fact, I've huddled through bull runs at this point. For example, the last bull run, I was expecting that it would go to 100K, 120K. I was looking at it at 60K. I was like, I'm not selling. And I held to that. The Bitcoin I have today is still Bitcoin that I had 4 years ago. So now we're seeing the all-time high coming back, and I'm very happy about it, because now I'm a cross bull run huddler.
I'm super excited to announce that this podcast got the first ever sponsor. 21 Bitcoin is Bitcoin only from day one, and they teach and preach self-custody. This is my go-to exchange when someone asks me, oh, where can I buy my Bitcoin from? This is the easiest entry for Bitcoiners. And if you want lower fees, plus at the same time support this podcast, use code Robin and click the link in the description. Very good. Yeah, and it's a great accomplishment to have more bull runs in the loop. And I think I started around 2020, and I did not sold a single Satoshi till now. I only bought
Oh yeah,
Bitcoin since 2020, and it feels really good.
wonderful. Yeah.
Um, it's an amazing story that you just told, where you went out of the traditional system and pursued your own, when I can say it like that, truth, and following your your gut feeling. And also I think that's a really motivating and inspiring story, when you say like, I was ready to be homeless, to not be a slave. that's
Yeah.
that's an amazing statement to make, and I love it. And I also just now did this. I actually had today my last real working day in the company. I
Oh
still
wow.
I still am employed 1 week, but I used my rest of my holidays now. So I can feel that, because I went through that change right now. I'm now 25, so I'm like a few years back from you, and I could see myself from you, like when you're like 28, because I also did quite good. I had a sales position really good. Like for my young age, I did really, really good also financially. And now I'm in this position where I can just quit it and pursue what I really want. And I
Yeah.
now started in December with the podcast, and I already have like 60 podcast episodes recorded. So really, really cool.
And
Um,
it takes some guts to do this for me, as opposed to someone who already has money, because I don't come from a family of money. So I realized doing this that there are people who are born with $1 million in the bank account and they have the luxury of making risky decisions. I don't, because from 16 years old, I knew it was I have to work to just maintain the bills, to just survive. I've had very good parents, but they are not rich parents, so they have not given me an inheritance. So I was like, okay, every step of this risky path, it's there's no safety net for me. My safety net is if I ever end up on the street, I can go live with my mom if that were to happen. But that's basically the extent of it. So it was a risky path to take when you consider that I do need an everyday salary to keep myself up.
Yeah, it's definitely a path that not a lot of people go. And it's like when you see and when you consider doing that, you also consider like the worst case scenario. What is if I don't make any money from it? What do I do then?
Yeah.
And like usually parents are a good safety net if you have the luxury to even if you have the luxury to go to your parents and live there. That's something not even everybody has, but most of the people have it. um, let's come back to the censorship topic, because I think it's really interesting what happens now with social media. We have the traditional Facebook, YouTube, where we just know there is censorship going on. You can call it whatever you want to call it, but there are some topics when you talk about them, you will get a shadow banned, or you get less reach, or it just outright they say this account is taken off. And I just like, sometimes by accident, sometimes by intentions, sometimes some bug happens. Like there's a lot of things going on. But then there's also now Twitter and X with the Twitter files from like 1-2 years ago. Now on X, there's still something going on, but it seems like there's more allowance of free speech. Then there's other places like Rumble and streaming places where it can be even more free. How do you see like the whole social media landscape and where you can stream, and how is it developing? Has it a good development now with maybe X and Elon Musk is having kind of a good approach to that, or like how do you see that?
I'm fascinated by the current state because I think that what Musk did with X is a gift to humanity. I believe that we had an internet that is born free. From 1995 to 2015, 16, we could do our job. And to me, and the internet already changed the world then. Because when lives came in, when live streaming, either live streaming of podcast or videos that were uploaded quick enough that they could basically be watched within the hour. Then we had a direct route that was not subject to supervision. People underestimate the fact of how the editorial period changes the relationship between the producer of information and the receiver. Because we were talking about central entity wiretapping at the middle, listening and censoring. These entities have a difficult time doing their job if I can go from producing the video to you hearing it within 10 seconds. Within 10 seconds, a human cannot. And so that's why these platforms, the more technologically evolved they became, when YouTube started allowing live video streaming, the more the window for intervention at the middle was closing. And we were at a point where I can think of something, I can communicate it, and there's no intervention possible. And to me, I thought this is new. It's a new thing for humanity to have this. The closest equivalent would be a large show in which you have an artist and you can directly speak to the crowd that's gathering, but that's local, it's isolated, and the artists are very often professionals who will not have an interest at shaking our beliefs. They will not have an interest at pursuing the contrarian route. So I believe that 2010 to 2016 was the first time in human civilization where the contrarian brain could directly gather an audience, talk to them directly, not have someone in the middle stopping his speech. And I wanted to exploit this to try to bring us into a new generation of media. So I started eventually doing my own streams, eventually started co-hosting Warski Live, which became the biggest live stream on back then on YouTube, and eventually moved from Warski Live to the public space, which became a podcast of kind of resistance, right-wing ideas. Now, often people will call it alt-right, but it's not a label that I particularly like. I consider myself just a right-wing thinker who's conscious about my racial identity and how currently white people are being targeted negatively. They're being hated. So those were the themes I approached, and I wanted to do something with the media that couldn't be done on cable TV, which is what happens if truly new ideas are thrown out there and they are provocative. And basically, from this to the COVID-19 stuff, I've always adopted a contrarian view against the normie world, which tries to make these subject taboos, which tries to impose, in the case of COVID, a kind of medical fascism. I thought, what if we were to use free speech for what it's been designed for from the beginning, which is you have this society that claims it's liberal, that claims it's open, and we want diversity, we want cognitive diversity. I'm going to give them something that's cognitively diverse. I'm going to give them what an artist looking at the world can think of it. And it's that we live in a very hypocritical world in which people have been feeling apparently entitled to decide what others consume in terms of medical vaccines, who judge each other, who imperialistically try to control their environments and their neighbors. That is not a liberal world in the way I was promised we were in a liberal world. That is a world of fascism, of control and authoritarianism. So I tried to live by the standards of the early liberals who have created our constitution and our world, which is liberty should be able, with speech, with well organized speech, we should be able to untie the shackles that were put over us. And that's what I've been pursuing with my media. And eventually, Susan Wojcicki at YouTube started highly controlling what we could say. I believe that there's still something that is not revealed publicly about how is it that we get so much censorship. I believe that someone must be paying for this. When I see Susan Wojcicki making deals with associations, non-governmental organization, and saying, "Oh, we will partner with the ADL on anti-Semitism, and we will partner with Pfizer on vaccines," I believe someone is pouring massive amounts of money on these platforms, either indirectly through purchasing ads or directly through funding. And they are basically setting up a totally anti internet system, because the internet precisely was meant to be modular, to be okay, if you don't pass this packet, I'm going to pass through another route. So that basically the signal will never be interfered with. But this trend of censorship is going totally against the original philosophy of the internet and totally against the philosophy of crypto also, which is that you should not be subjected to review for something you engage freely in. One example be, and one of the biggest subject, the one that is most taboo, is one that I've addressed, which is Jews in civilization. And I've always tried to approach it in the most wise and non-hateful and loving way, because I feel no hate for the Jews, but there are a certain amount of contributions they have done to Western civilization that I believe we should face. We should be honest about the fact that they are overrepresented in certain industries and that it could change the directions we take. So I've been engaging on this subject, and eventually, unfortunately, YouTube took the direction of any talking of Jews, even if you're positive, even if you're saying that you're not hateful, it's going to be anti Semitism. They've basically defined the whole thing, which I think is self punishing for these minorities. Just saying LGBT on YouTube would demonetize your video, because there were so much anti LGBT videos that the algorithm would basically decide, oh, it's probably edgy. But we found ourselves in a bizarre situation where people who are lesbians or trans, they were finding all of their videos demonetized. just because they were touching about the subject that totally concerns themselves, but the algorithm had decided generally it's right wing belief, so we're going to censor it. So you are shooting yourself in the foot with censorship. And what Elon did is he came back and he brought it back. He brought back the internet before censorship, how it looked like. It's still not perfect. I think that Elon has kept Nick Fuentes away from Twitter. He has kept certain of my friends and people who are close to me ideologically. I find this very deplorable. But at least he tried, and he shot not so far from the target. So that is very good. We are in a very hopeful situation because eventually, if there's just one big platform that can do this, the free market forces can reconfigure. And perhaps in the future, in 10 years from now, YouTube may lose the status of the biggest video platform because of this. Or they will have to change the way they impede on their creators' ability to think. Because that is the greatest critique that I have of YouTube and censorship in general. It's that it's the the torture that they do cognitively to people. Because okay, deleting a video is not that dramatic. If as a business you may say, well, I don't like this video on my business, it's not good for my business, so I delete it. If it was just this, it wouldn't be that dramatic. But YouTube first is punishing you for life, is cutting your opportunities to make money in the future because of that video. That's a problem. And most importantly, it's telling creators you have to self censor before it gets to our video, or else you're going to get a strike. By doing so, they are imposing a weight on creators like me that has been really feeling like torture over the years. And that's why I had to leave YouTube. I went for Odyssey because they were, cryptocurrency tied, and I really like their philosophy. So it's just painful to be a creator and to think, not only do I have to think of each sentence and whether it truly fits the TOS, I also have to think about my guest, and I have to hold my mouse on the mute button just in case this guest goes too far. It's unfair to be imposing this burden, and especially when this burden is being imposed unfairly. Because whenever you have a human system deciding what you can say and think, it's of course going to be biased. And in this case, it is heavily biased for left wing ideas, so that you can have black people call for very dirty stuff considering white people, and yet you have white people doing the same and they get censored. The black people don't get censored for the same. So there's no justice in this system. It's a system that inherits all of the features of the unjust system I've seen through my life, being oppressed by them. And I'm like, okay, this is the normie world coming to the internet, and we have to leave these places and go into a further exodus.
Yeah, it's I think Elon Musk is doing something really great, and I think he is really cautious with doing that. Because he has gone, like, he took a long time also to take Alex Jones back, but
Yeah.
he's finally back. I think it's just like a progress he's taking. He does not want to like completely open it on like day one, and he's slowly getting it back. And he even threatens a lot, I think, YouTube in a massive way. He's like with Mr. Beast and experiment with in front of the video of the monetization, because this drives creators, of course. If you
Yes.
get from one platform like 10x the money you get from another platform, of course you create more here, and this is the
Yes.
incentive structure. And he is doing the first step with the monetization of Twitter, and now with the videos also. I guess they will get like a video portion, video tab on Twitter quite soon. I mean, he teased that for like half a year now, but I think he will get to that point. Otherwise, they can never really compete with YouTube if there's not a nice interface to it. And yeah, I think he's doing a good thing. But for me, the underlying thing that's always is weird when we talk about social media and media in general is like, people have to start think critical of stuff, because this is where the problems come. Because if a platform is censoring, people will notice if they start thinking critical for themselves, and they were like, oh, YouTube is censoring this and this and that, and X is not, and this platform is not, and this platform is not, so I will switch to them. So like I think we have like a fundamental crisis with critical thinking in our society, where most people just believe what they hear from any authority they seem to fit in their authority scheme. So maybe a weird question, but why is it so hard for people to think critical for themselves?
Well, I think of it from a biological perspective always, because I think that biology explains everything that we are. And the way I see it is it's a fatality. It will always be this, because you have no mechanism to maintain in society the capacity for rationality. Because the fact is, it's not that evolutionarily beneficial to be intelligent and rational. So what you end up with systematically, because a discovery costs a lot to make. I think just of my theory, the theory of phenotypic revolution, I had to spend 10 years, and it was a lot of sacrifice to get to it. It was a lot of thinking, a lot of energy, a lot of calories that went only to this. Now, so from an evolutionary perspective, being a thinker and being rational is not very advantageous, especially when thoughts are super easily copyable. It's super easy for someone to be a sheep and say, okay, well, whatever is the religion where I'm born, whatever is the standard of living and the standard of etiquette, I'm going to just absorb everything around me and I'm going to accept it as truth. That is probably a much lower calorie, much lower energy investment, and you probably get to pretty much as good as the intelligent person, because the intelligent person himself will have made a discovery in one field, but in 99% of what he does in his life, he's going to have to trust other people. So even a very stubborn and isolated individual does end up trusting a lot of people in what he eats, what he breathes, what he does. Every tool he uses are made by other people. So I believe it's the state of human civilization, and it's a natural default convergence where intelligence is truly just an accident. And most of the time, everyone evolves toward being less intelligent and more sheepy and more following. So I say you'll always have this. The only reason the early internet gave a different view of this is you have a self selection event that happened. The early internet was populated by visionaries, liberty lovers, and people with independent thinking that were kind of autistic. Now, as soon as the internet got regularized and got normified, if you will, it got populated by the rest of the population that always follow up wherever. Which is why, for people like me who are contrarian and isolationist, kind of, and libertarians, basically, life is a constant exodus. I always ask myself, how do I get further away from people? Because every time I did, it made me more happy.
It's an interesting way to look at it. It's like going away from people is making you more happy. I get sick of it. Yeah, it's interesting. For closing up the podcast, we have an end routine where the previous guest is always asking a question for the next guest without knowing who's the next guest is. And as I have a lot of Bitcoiners on, it's obviously a Bitcoin question. And it's an interesting one because we have in Bitcoin, it's like money is so fundamental to our life. Money, if we fix money, we can fix so many problems in our society. So we have this saying, Bitcoin fixes everything. And he raised one point where like, I don't know how Bitcoin fixes that. And he asked, how can Bitcoin help someone living like paycheck to paycheck help this person who is living paycheck to paycheck, or if can Bitcoin even help this person?
Well, absolutely, absolutely. because Bitcoin can make you realize that you have an out. And just having that out might change your mentality about some of the things that you spend on paycheck to paycheck. As long as you are stuck in this eternal cycle of paying the bills, trying to make money at the job and trying to get some overtime so you get a little extra, and then seeing it all being drained from your bank account for just your survival, you might not see that there are things that you consider in your survival to be necessary for now that you could get rid of. But once suddenly this option comes of a true ledger where you can truly store, suddenly you might realize, hey, there are things that are less important than I thought they were. Maybe I don't need to go to McDonald's today. Maybe that $5 could be a good investment for Bitcoin. And when you start thinking about the infinity that stems from a finite supply, you start realizing that, hey, this $5 invested today in 100 years from now could be the equivalent of $1 million. With all the Bitcoin that will be lost, with all the imperfections of the system, that $5 may very well be $1 million in finite energy thinking. So when you have that option, you might realize that, hey, what the life you've been living of slavery and paycheck to paycheck is not as closed loop as you think. It's just that the option wasn't there. Before Bitcoin, the option was, oh, maybe I'm going to put in a savings account. Maybe I'm going to buy a certificate of deposit for $100. And all of it had cost and all of it were low interest. When you start thinking that you can truly accumulate the energy of a $5, you're going to realize that you're living to paycheck does as place for a little extra. Use that little extra to help your descendants down the line. Because the best thing you can do in your life, paycheck to paycheck, the day you die, there's probably going to be nothing left of you, especially if you don't have a house, you don't have an inheritance. But you can store 24 words on a piece of metal right now, and your great grandchildren might see you as the most visionary man for having stored $5 away for them.
It's a great way to think about it, and like even as you said, like you got some Bitcoin on your live stream, like 0.1, 0.05, and it was not a big deal back then. It was like a few euros, but it turned out to be a big deal in hindsight. And
Yeah.
you never know what happens, and we're so early in the game. People don't realize that we are actually that early in Bitcoin. It's like so early, like 1995 in the internet. Seem like the iPhone is still 12 years away.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you for being on. Thank you for taking the time. And yeah, is there anything you want to add, or where can people find you? Where can people get in touch with you the best way?
Uh, I will say shout out to trigger a part of your audience. I will say shout out to the ordinals lover. And if you want to read my ordinals letter to humanity, because that's one function of the blockchain we haven't talked about today, but you can store messages for humanity forever on the blockchain. And I did it to write a letter to humanity. You can go check it out at jfg.world, and you'll see all of my links on there. My letter to humans on gene editing, talking to future humans. That is one thing that the Bitcoin blockchain has allowed me to do that I never thought I could, because we die, entropy takes everything we do away, but entropy has no take on the Bitcoin blockchain.
Amazing. Thank you for being on. It was a pleasure.
Bye bye.